Excellence webinar titled 21st Century Lean Business Transformation, Compression Thinking. The second in a series of 3 webinars. I am Jerry Strohmeyer, the Education and Training Program Coordinator for AME, and I will be your moderator. Today's presenters are Robert Hall, Monique DeMay, and Jack Ward. Hall is the chairman of the Compression Institute and a 37-year veteran of Lean. He is a co-founder of AME and was the editor of Target Magazine for 22 years. Jack is the author of 2 books, Compression and Zero Inventories. Monique DeMay is the Lean Six Sigma Black Belt and Kaizen Promotion Officer at Simmons Bedding. She has over 25 years in quality, technical, manufacturing, and engineering in several industries, including plastics, aerospace, food and electronics for both military and commercial markets. Jack Ward is the Vice President of the Compression Institute. He has extensive top executive experience with Melville Corporation and as a turnaround executive for several other companies. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. You will see that you are muted on your attendee panel on the right side of your screen. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into your question area in the attendee panel and click on Submit. We will review as many questions at the end of today's presentation and answer as many as we can. When you log off today, please check your email inbox, and it will be an invitation and link to fill out a short webinar attendee survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey today, as your feedback is very important to us to improve future webinars. Our presenters have also graciously agreed to provide a PDF of today's presentation. We will be sending that along with a recorded link for a webinar replay to each of you next week. Now, I am pleased to introduce Doc Hall, Monique DeMay, and Jack Ward, who will present 21st Century Lean Business Transformation, Compression Thinking. Take it away, Monique.
Thank you, Jerry Ann, and welcome to webinar number 2. I'm going to recap a little bit from webinar number 1 in case some of you were not at this particular webinar. We started with history and highlights of Lean and Toyota and talked about how Toyota evolved right after World War II. They were in crisis. They needed to really improve their quality. They just didn't want to reduce waste, and they wanted to be much more competitive in the automotive industry. So we showed how Toyota went through their steps and evolved their Toyota production system. We also talked a little bit about why Lean did not reach its potential, especially in North America, and talked about the challenges that we see in North America, especially when there's differences in values and philosophies compared to what the values and philosophies in Japan were. And that included discussion of mechanical lean, which we'll talk even more about mechanical lean today. But essentially, it's just mechanical lean is just going through all of the steps, but not really getting the philosophies and values that are very important in a company to really make lean stick and be successful. Finally, we also talked about Sekisui, which is a company that went above and beyond lean, and we showed their products and how they went even further in lean applications, working with their company and with their employees on going above and beyond lean with their values. And then finally, we introduced the Excellence Maturity Matrix, which we'll go through a little bit more in this webinar, number 2. Next slide. Next, thank you. The factors that limit lean in North America, essentially in North America, which was different than what Toyota and Sekisui went through, was that the company was owned by an owner. It was an asset of ownership, not the people. And we talked about mechanical lean last time, but it's really techniques. Mechanical lean, if you're studying or working in a company that's practicing lean and you have mechanical lean, it's essentially we're only doing techniques, we're only doing tools, but we're not affecting the culture of the company and the people in the company to make them successful in lean. A lot of the legacy concepts and systems didn't change, and staff was in charge of the program, which was managed by results. It wasn't looking at the values and the culture and how they're affecting the people. And then it rarely led to an alternative business model. So those were some of the key factors we talked about in the last webinar that really contributed to lean being very limited in North America. So as we go forward in this webinar, I'm going to hand it off to Doc and Jack, and they're going to get into much more detail on compression and lean.
Thanks, Monique, and you should see now a little quickie overview of what we're going to cover. It's quite a bit to cover. We're going to jump from the tip of one iceberg to another. There's no way you can explain all this in an hour any more than you can explain all about lean in an hour, but we'll give you an idea of it. The slides are numbered. You can see it usually in the upper right-hand corner. And we're going to have some icons that identify each topic as you go through, and you'll see those usually in the upper left-hand corner, and you see the icons down the side. So we'll begin with that maturity index. Talk a little bit about leadership for transformation, major transformation. Talk about compression. What is it? Why are we concerned about being squeezed on a finite earth? We'll give another example, this one from North America, a scientific cleaning network for cleaning buildings. There are 6 principles of compression thinking. We'll really concentrate on 2 of them, the quality before quantity and physical measurement before financial ones, and finish with a little idea of what a vigorous learning organization is, which we'll get into in webinar 3. So onto this organizational maturity index. Now, this isn't some tablet coming off a mountain. We're always trying to do better, trying to condense maybe 20, 30 years of what we've seen into one chart. And so, of course, it gets cluttered. But if you begin on the left-hand column, way down at the bottom where it says proficient, and then you move up this way, then proficient really is what we call mechanical lean, and may be pretty good at it. There are quite a few companies today that are proficient in making core operations flow, but the staff still coaching the tools, and so you can read on across and you kind of see there. They're doing quite well, thank you, and generally they're good corporate citizens, at least in the community in which they live. Now, the tough area is leadership of major transformation. To go from there to the vigorous level, that's where people have to change some values and the leaders really have to get it. And so if you go up to the next level called vigorous, what you're really trying to do is create a system including people that almost runs itself, at least for anything that's an ongoing business. Up at the top you see enduring, and that's becoming resilient in compression. That is, it easily adapts to almost anything that comes at it. That's tough, but once you cross that leadership divide, it becomes a lot easier to visualize where you might be going way over on that left-hand column. And look just at this one here, the middle, vigorous. At that point, a company is intending to serve all its stakeholders, not just the customer well, and maybe a few others, but they're trying to do well by everybody, including the environment. They may be getting a start on what today is often called lean and green. That is combining lean Kaizen teams with some people that are familiar with sustainability, may become familiar with a tool or two that lean people usually aren't, like life cycle analysis or mass energy balance, often just mass balance in practice. And that's a stepping stone to go to the next higher level of extended responsibility, somewhat like Seiki Sui is moving into, where they aren't just building a house, they are attempting to make that house suitable for the occupant over a lifetime of change of the environment and of the lifetime needs of the occupant. Now, the axes involve culture. That's a sloppy thing to define, but one of the simplest definitions ever heard in a factory was, this is how we do things around here. That's the culture, including the people. Not a bad definition. This is a little simplified version of that cluttered chart. And so, reiterate the key points. Proficient level, we're concentrating on operational improvement. The vigorous level, create a learning system that almost runs itself. The people are managing themselves to a very large extent. And that's a different leadership task, and we'll talk about that one in a minute. And then at the higher level, enduring, become engaged. The company starts to grow outside of itself and really look at its long-term effectiveness, doing something important to society. Now we're starting leadership for transformation, big transformation. And leadership is really a practice. We questioned whether we ought to talk about this. I don't think many people change their leadership by reading about it or maybe even attending a seminar, including this one. What we usually do is emulate leaders that we think have been successful, and we'll try to copy them. So you can improve by emulation, but maybe the most important factor is to have some emotion, some identification with the mission you're on or the organization in which you work or which you lead. So a little example may help. About 10, 12 years ago, I was doing a Target story about a hospice, a tough hospice. Part of it was a children's hospice. This is emotionally draining work. Most people that work there just needed to get away and relieve themselves from it for a while, and maybe they could come back. And so they had a neat system for very promptly attending to patient call lights and a few other things, and it was a neat little small lean type story. But gathering this, I kept hearing about the administrator. She sounded like the angel over the whole place, everybody's inspiration. And as they put it, she took her finances and so on, so other people didn't have to worry about that. But at the end, I've got to find out what this leader is. So I have my interview, and it was short. I said, what ideas do you have about leadership? And her response was, I don't have any ideas about leadership. I cannot separate my hospice from my life. And she referred to it as a calling, and so did everybody else in that. That's a common term in hospice work. It is a calling. It's not something that you're there doing just for the money. And that's the kind of thing that it takes. Jack, you've been in all kinds of senior leadership positions, and what's your take on this?
The word leadership is very important here. Many companies in the United States have adapted a lean in terms of the various methods, implement them, but they've never really got the same results that Toyota did. And we've identified over the years that this is related to that we haven't properly made a lean transformation. Here are some of the factors. We call the present mode of leadership a mechanical lean leadership, and also versus what we would like to see, a transformative leadership. Under the content of a typical mechanical lean leader, they just direct people. Versus transformation, they ask strategic questions and expect people to start thinking. They review performance as a mechanical leader versus being a mentor, frequently asking questions and then also being mentored too. That's the transformative. Mechanical tends to let the old system drag on. They tend to overlay a lot of the lean methods and procedures on top of an old system that may not be suited for it. The transformative leader really jumps in and makes up new stories to share and to remove obstacles, the most important part of their job. The mechanical leader also can't admit being ignorant. They want to have all the answers versus all the right questions. The transformative leader, it practices leading as a learning opportunity. This clearly was what happened after the Second World War with Toyota. They had to learn a new way of approaching manufacturing. The mechanical leader imposes methods versus the transformative leader will develop people to devise new methods themselves. Doctor, give me the 9, please. Next. Leadership for business, meaning from the top down, it is not just for lean. We're talking about lean being more than just the procedures and the practices. Lean is a way of perceiving and an alternative model for running your company. Typically, companies today do a business as usual leadership approach versus, again, what we call the transformative leader. They try to grow by extending the current business model, whereas a transformative leader frames new visions serving all the stakeholders, and they see the world more than just the assembly line or the insides of the operation of a factory. The business as usual leader tends to look for success top line and bottom line. The transformative leader really defines success himself by being an example for others to learn from. Again, business as usual leader looks at the hierarchy and rules and command and control approach. The transformative leader operates by vigorous learning disciplines. The business as usual leader also assumes that the world is static, whereas the transformative leader looks at and grasps the concepts of compression thinking. Just focusing in on assuming the world is static is a big problem in leadership of a business and in the executive office. How do we handle the real world that we all know, looking at our newspapers every day, that have many new variables that we can't control? It's complex and continually going on. Doc, if you want to jump in and take the next one and show this complexity.
Well, this fancy slide, certainly complicated enough. And of course it's environmentally oriented, but there are a lot of other threats and problems out there also. And you can't put everything on one screen, and nobody can track or follow all this. Indeed, one of the problems is even that specialists in one of these areas may not know very much about the others. And sometimes that's called reductionism in science and engineering. You can see an awful lot of a piece of a problem, but never put together very well how it all fits together and what it may mean for us. So let's just take an example to start. If I can get my mouse working again, up in the upper right-hand corner is a little thing called ozone hole. A lot of misinterpretation about what the ozone hole was and still is. It's still there. And so I heard people say that, oh, it shouldn't be a big problem. All you got to do is cover up a little bit or use more sunscreen and it won't burn you. Missed the point that increased ultraviolet radiation was a threat to both plant and animal life, and we depend on the plants and the animals. You let that hole grow so it covers a big chunk of the earth, that's a problem big time, maybe even an existential problem. And we're not out of the woods with that yet, because while the freon's gone, there are other ozone catalysts that go up there, and that thing may never disappear. If we didn't watch out, it could grow. So it's something to, it's out of the news, but it could come back. Or taking another one way over on the other side, healthcare, which is certainly impinged by all the rest. If you want an example of complicated problems with healthcare, and have you tried to interpret a medical bill recently? And you know what fuzz and complexity is. And one of the problems in healthcare, despite all the lean that's gone into it, is that it's attacked pieces of it. It has not attacked the fundamental values or the structural separations between different healthcare providers. And we all, if you're involved in that kind of a system, you're all plagued with that. In addition, the healthcare system is really a sick care system, and much more money and attention is given to that than all the wellness programs and everything else that we try to do to keep you in a healthy state so you don't need to get into sickness care. Let's leave that one, and you can pretty easily see, though, that the health care is affected by a lot of the rest of these. I've taken all this bunch of stuff and put them in the 4 balls that you see. Will address finite resources. If you are releasing a lot of toxicity and too much stuff to the environment, then it makes it precarious. That is, you don't know what you can kick away at some point unawares that might be important to us. Nearly all this stems from just consuming and therefore making too much stuff. And if you're in manufacturing, that's not a happy thought. It means we're too successful. We're making too much. Yep. Not money, but just too much stuff. And so there's some ideas along that line, and I hope that you would develop a good deal more yourself. And a fairly hidden part of this is pushback on it. We all like the benefits of an industrial society. We don't like it when the effects of that trouble us personally. Like right here in Texas, you got people that are objecting to fracking because it messes up their land. It decreases the land value. And the more we have to do to keep this system going that affects more and more people, the more that pushback you're going to get. And then just plain shortages are way down at the root of other problems in the news that typically cover up the root cause. For instance, the Arab Spring in several countries began in Tunisia with a food riot. The government in Egypt today doesn't seem to be dealing any better with the need for big subsidies for fuel and food that keep the restive population a little more content. And in Syria, all that began about 4 years ago when the Assad government didn't do anything, and an awful lot of the farmers were suffering from an intense drought. So you had all kinds of murmuring and discontent, and all that blew into what you can see there today. So the potential for that to be drastic is there. You can't discount it. If you duck down at the bottom of that, you can't deal with this by trying to come up with some formulas for risk management. Need to become resilient to whatever kind of change is going to come. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into one part of this, which is shortages. So this is also a busy slide. Up the y-axis is energy return on investment. That is, for oil, how many barrels of oil do you have to use to get more barrels of oil? And if you look at the blue ovals, in 1930, domestic oil was almost 100 to 1. That is, for every barrel of oil you use getting oil, you got 100. It's no wonder they called it black gold. By 1970, you see where this had diminished. It was down to an average of about 35. And today, domestic oil may be down to an average of 25. Imported oil is about the same, not much better. Didn't put it in to relieve the clutter, but natural gas about the same. You see coal, that's a big one, and the return on energy is still pretty good, and that's why a lot of people say, oh, you can't get rid of that, no matter what it does. And then nuke isn't as good as a lot of people think. It takes a lot of energy to mine it, takes a lot of energy to refine it. It's a huge expense to build a plant. And so altogether, the energy expended to get energy out of nuke is not as high a ratio as you might think. It's usually estimated somewhere between 8 and 12, 15 maybe. And and going to something like a thorium reactor might be a little bit better on some problems, but it doesn't make that problem go away. And then you look at the little rectangles down in the corner near the axis of this thing, and what are our alternatives like photovoltaic or wind or ethanol or whatever people are campaigning for. The return on energy isn't very good. And so that's the kind of world we're looking at. And the people that really examine this try to think through what return on energy would you need in total to retain a world somewhat like that we now have. And the usual speculation floats around with, 8 or 10 maybe to 1. Ancient agricultural societies were more like 3 to 1. And if you really want the energy problem, you look at energy, that red bar way out to the right. Energy consumption in 2005 exceeded the annual biomass potential of the entire lower 48 states. It's pretty obvious that this thing can't go on the way it is. Now, nobody knows when or where or exactly how, but something big is in the offing in the 21st century, maybe not too far out. And don't get me started on why oil prices yo-yo so much. Down at the bottom, you got the same thing with minerals, a lot of them. David Roper is one of several people who have done calculations that even give allowances for a lot of recycling, and you don't retain everything every time you recycle because you lose some. And even allowing for all that, nearly all of our commonly used minerals will deplete down to where things are really tough before the end of the 21st century. That's beginning now, and some of the severe ones may occur within 10, 20 years at the current rate of growth. If we stop using so much, of course, you stretch things out much further, and we've got enough time to think about how to do it better. Summarizing all this, why compression? Well, because coming at us is if one thing doesn't get us and limit our growth, another one's going to. And you have to think systems. What affects what affects what? And you can't continue to assume that we can always just go get more, that it's there somewhere. This transformation is big. It's rethinking what we do and why. Some value shifts, a bigger deal than lean by far. So how can we learn to live well and use less and greatly reduce our use of energy, raw material, and have far fewer toxic releases? That'll make a lot of big problems smaller. It doesn't take care of all of our problems, but at least begins cutting them down to size. The current business system, that's slide 13, based on expansion. It's a hidden assumption that we can grow indefinitely. In fact, the answer to all problems usually is, just grow the company, grow the economy, grow something. That'll get us out of trouble. But if you really are going into compression, that assumption is highly doubtful. Compression thinking accepts that there are limits. They're fuzzy. You aren't quite sure when and exactly where. Some of you may have big trouble with water right now, a few with energy. Some of you may experience raw material shortages. So the real question is, how do we have a high quality of life, or at least one acceptable to us, and use a lot less stuff? But to do that, the rules of business in the 21st century are going to be kind of upside down compared with the 20th. Here's another summary, slide 14. Compression thinking brings on a different concept of success. It's resilient to huge changes. If we've got to respond to a lot of different things coming at us, how do we prepare for that? Or a little more pragmatically, and I emphasize that, how can we learn to live better and use a lot less? And we think vigorous learning by groups of people, companies, will begin to do that. We got to think about a lot more, a lot quicker, and in a timely fashion in order to cope with what's coming at us. We're now beginning with principles of compression thinking. You can see there are 6 of them. all of them tumble out of that axiom that the world and all in it are finite. If you scan that quickly, note that we've really talked about number 1. Number 6, thinking holistically, that ought to start being obvious by now. We're really only going to go into much more depth on 2 and 4. But 5, for example, that's taking PDCA, A3, DMA, C4, whatever you call it, and greatly extending that. Don't stop with 5 whys. Go for 100 or more. Gather more information and abide by all the facts. We have a tendency to limit our problem solving into a little narrow space where we can deal with it. So nothing wrong with the methodology. Just figure out how to expand it. Number 3, economy of learning. We used to refer to companies having General Motors disease. That is, they got so big that they had real trouble just communicating with themselves, at least the way they were structured. Toyota and all the other big car companies have a very similar problem today. It's just that General Motors was notorious for it. We'll defer 2 and 4 for a little later and hop into an example. And this is the scientific cleaning one from the U.S. And it's a methodology for cleaning large buildings. And there is a network of users all using a similar or same standard process. There are a number of big universities, some national labs. Boeing is probably the only big commercial user, some prisons, K-12 schools, and so on that are into this. And where they are so far, the improvement of cleaning has come from a lot of little things. So, for example, portion pack chemical has this rule of 1. So they make their soap or their detergent in a pack. You fill a bucket up from the line, you drop in 1 pack, and you got about the right concentration for good quality cleaning. And that's the important part. How do you improve the quality of cleaning and use less? And this process does. So there's more to it than that, but that's a beginning part. It sounds very much like a lean story, and in many ways it is. But the key to this one is educating janitors to be professionals. 100 hours or more of education, not just training. The training doesn't take very long. The education, longer, and it's never ending. In other words, educate people on why they do what they do, not just how to do it. And when you have that, they take great pride in what they do, and they will respond magnificently when some mess, big mess really happens. Things are not normal, because they will figure out what to do just as well as anybody else will. And the dictum is clean for health first, and a very important part of this is turning a janitor into a first-class citizen, not somebody that's got a minimum wage job because they can't do anything else. And a good many of them feel so down that they'll hardly even look in the eye. Next time you find a janitor doing a good job, thank them for what they do. It's worth it. They're real people. This is a diagram of the network, which it took me a while to figure out what they're doing. But you can see 2 kind of light greenish circles there at the top. Management is an outfit that trains the trainers for all of the users, gets them started, and it goes around later and does audits. They share audit results. They do an awful lot of benchmarking one with the other. And so this really is a learning network, and I found that it's a pretty hot network. If somebody finds out a better way to do something, it spreads pretty quickly. The Simon Institute has no employees. It's just an empty institution that collects some money and commissions, studies on things like pathogens on surfaces and so on, the kind of thing that no user really wants to fund just by themselves. But now let's concentrate on suppliers, and again go back to Portion Pack, that company at the bottom. Marvin Klein was a founder of Portion Pack, and I'm not sure whether Marvin's on the call, but he has a book with a title that almost says it all. It's Why Go Into Business to Make Money When There Are So Many Other Good Reasons. And the real mission or objective of that company is to change the process of cleaning for the United States, if not the world. Make cleaning a much higher quality, better outcome process, first in buildings and then maybe for everybody. And it's a small company. This network is very small compared with cleaning in the entire United States, but it's beginning to have an influence out of all proportion to its size. The idea is to demonstrate and make standard a much better method of cleaning, and based on some lean principles, you standardize, you improve the process, you standardize again, you improve the process. That should sound familiar. Coming off of that, back to those principles of compression thinking, the one that we skipped over was quality over quantity, and what's that mean? Well, thinking about effectiveness before efficiency. For example, Seiki Sui is looking for long-term effective solutions for residential housing for the people that are their customers. It's not just build a house and see how quick you can put it up. That's very important to delivering what they do, but it's not the key. That's the key, again, is long-term operative quality for the purpose. A second one is first do no harm. That's a physician slogan. If you can't make somebody better, well, at least don't do something that makes them worse. And an important adjunct to that is called the precautionary principle. If you've never heard of it, it briefly means that the party taking action is responsible to assure that there's no harm. If a company adopts that, it's probably going to be ahead of regulations almost every time. In fact, they would be a standard setter. They'd be making up regulations that the sluggards have got to figure out. Now, they'll not relieve a company from having to fill out the forms. But you take the lead in assuring that best you know that there's not going to be unintended consequences now or as far into the future as you can see. That's not the legal system of the United States today. Other countries have a little more of the precautionary principle in their legal systems, and usually our companies don't like them. They get too tough on them. The last one is to simplify for effectiveness, not just efficiency. And for that, go back to healthcare again. Simplify the structure of the thing, and for learning and for crosstalk, not just to make little pieces and parts efficient. I got a little story to illustrate that. In 1981, I made a presentation on what we now call lean to the top command of General Motors, including Roger Smith and these boys. I think I did okay, not great, but their eyes glazed over. Two of them had operating experience, and the rest of them had no idea what I was talking about, because their idea of improvement was to substitute computerization and automation for labor. That continued to be an obsession for so many of them that I found executives that could not understand lean or waste in the sense we know it when they looked right at it. And that's still true. And then later, I heard Bill Ford and saw a release from Fujio Toyota on converting the company into a transportation service company. In other words, they could begin to think about the question of how could the world be better off if we didn't burn so much fuel and have so many vehicles out there. Neither company has begun to address that because they're in the trap of having to survive in an expansionary business system without being able to really think about what's important to them and to society long term, even though they know it. The second one is physical measures over monetary ones. There are 4 key points here. That if you use interest or discounted cash flow, those are growth formulas. If you're using that to measure your improvement, you've got to bias the yardage ruler from the get-go. the physical measurements don't have a growth bias. The second one that many people in lean experience is the cost system doesn't really track the reality. It's been true for a long time. There are cost models that are better than others. If you find some that are useful, we have to have some just to be able to price and to know whether we're taking in more money than we spend. But don't be deceived by it. What you can see or what you can measure physically is a closer representation of reality, because anytime you use a dollar multiplier on anything, you're using a human valuation. It's subjective, and just international exchange rates will screw you up, and they do. But despite that, what's happening physically in the U.S. in an identical process would be the same in China. Forget the exchange rate. Two more. One is externalizing the cost. That's a cost not shown in our books. And a common example of that with companies is to take in inventory from suppliers on consignment. Well, it's not on our books, but that doesn't mean that it isn't there. And so if the company isn't doing very well, you seek to externalize some costs. If you're just looking at physical measures and you're not tying yourself to looking at a process inside some transactional boundary that defines a company, it's a whole lot harder to fool yourself. The last one is stranded assets, which is beginning to be a problem that will probably become a much bigger one. Quite a few lean companies have this because, let's say, you improve both the productivity of equipment and people by half. That is, only half the plant now can do what a full plant did 3, 5, 10 years ago. But unless more work has come in, you're not using that half of the plant. But maybe you're still paying for it. And by the way, that applies to people. A stranded asset is a person who is quite valuable that is no longer needed. So what do you do? How do you pay them? There is no great solution to this right now. A common example of this in fishing is somebody that has a fishing boat with a big loan against it, but the fishery is depleting. But since they have the big loan, they feel compelled to go out and fish anyway until every last fish is gone. So the boat is a stranded asset. Our system, based on expansion, does not have a great solution to that, and it's a problem that's awaiting some very imaginative thought. This is a fancy slide. It takes a minute to load. This is the Vigorous Learning Organization, and that's what we'll be getting into with Webinar 3. So for now, just begin with a few key points, beginning with the leadership, which we discussed briefly earlier. Leadership for what? Not leadership leading a riot or an athletic cheering event. Leadership of a learning organization, and vigorous is intended to mean these are the doers doing a lot of the learning. It's not a bunch of academics off somewhere. The people that do the doing do the learning. Seeing the whole, we've covered that somewhat. Seeing a big picture. Number 3 is a pretty key one, having a common mission, because that helps tie people together. And if you've got a mission or a calling that is bigger than just, let's help the company make money, you have created a little more inspiration for people to come into work every day and to be thinking about it even when they're not at work. Number 4 is a rigorous learning system. 2 parts of that, using the scientific method in some form. And the second part is having a documentation system that's not hard to use and that people actually do use. And OAME has a lot going now, or is starting to get a lot going on knowledge management, and some of the IT methodology can help us do that. But no matter what the methodology is, the key part of that is to have people actually use it. For example, if you have an A3 paper system, your Kaizen or your project or your program is not really done until you have thought through the A3 paper that documents it and put it somewhere where somebody else can find it. That keeps us from starting absolutely cold and all too often resolving a problem that somebody worked on a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But maybe the real key is behavior. So that's people dedicated to learning. That is the job, and they're not holding back sharing with others. They're not pointing fingers. They're not coming to meetings with hidden agendas and trying to gain status and whatever. They're staying on topic and on target. And a few little rules, like rules for meetings, that, key phrase, if somebody's going out of bounds with a meeting, is say, is this meeting going below the belt or something? And somebody knows that, oops, I'm straying, and we will all do that. At a little tougher level, if you've got really major clashes in values, people can't even agree that a problem exists. Now then, you need to go to rules for dialogue and do a lot more working of it out. And you may get into that. You may have already. Down at the bottom, you notice that black band, continuous cultural reinforcement. What we're really asking people to do, even in the better lean companies today, is not natural human behavior. We're trying to get beyond how we would just behave normally. And so it has to be reinforced almost daily. You've got to build something into it that is a reminder of here's how we behave. And you can do that in part by changing what people do, and they'll learn to behave differently. But nonetheless, the further you go with this, the tougher it is to sustain it. Well, we're about out of time, so quickie review. Here's what we've covered and whistled through. That maturity index, that organizational maturity index, a little bit about leadership for transformation, compression, what is it, why do we need to do something that is very, very different in the 21st century, that example of a scientific cleaning network, some principles of compression thinking, which we barely skimmed, and we finished off with a little introduction to the vigorous learning organization, which we'll take up next time. And finally, here are a few questions for you to think about, and hopefully come back to webinar 3, or just engage with us in talking about this stuff. You do not pick up on this in the 45 minutes or so that you've had to think about it so far. It's a lot deeper thought than that. So from what do you know now? What's waste? Really? If you think effectiveness, what's waste? What's work? How do your decisions affect all your stakeholders? Ever thought about that? Or can you begin to think about assumptions of business as usual that have been hidden, and now they're opening to you asking questions? So if you want to dig in a little bit more on some of this, go to our website, and Updates has a string of stuff going way back on various kinds of environmental problems and some of these issues, or just email me. And I think we're done, and do we have questions?
Okay, great. Thanks, Doc. Now we'll take any questions, and if you have any questions, please submit them on the right side of your screen, and I'll read them. And to start us off, Doc, what are the challenges to change management from mechanical lean to transformational leadership?
Well, I think we started to address that with that discussion on transformational leadership. It really is a values change and kind of a gut level change in the senior people leading a transformation. That's the challenge. And if they don't see that challenge, it's not going to happen. And if they see it and they're unwilling to try to tackle it, it's not going to happen. By far the best lean transformations I've seen have almost all been headed by a senior leader that truly gets it, supports the change, and clears obstacles. That is, if people are not working out, what say, leave the company, there may be some casualties. But they begin to reorganize the company. They take lean all through the company, the entire company, and all of its policies and its procedures, and even what it thinks it is, and what their ambitions are for the future change because of this transformation. Well, that's tough. That's not a best I can do in about 1 minute.
Okay, great. Thanks. And about how long does it take to create a vigorous learning organization?
I'm not sure it's an answerable question, because it's kind of like asking how long does it take to create lean. There's always somewhere else you can go with it. But if you just took a lean organization to, say, a fairly vigorous level, most of them that have gotten to a level something like that, maybe 3 years. Good estimates, maybe 6, 7, because you have to unlearn a lot of habits, as you know, just to get from ground zero the trust of employees on some parts of it can take a year. If you go back and look at the old Toyota example, they didn't have any guideline, and they may have had some advantages. It was, about 25 years before they really had what we describe as TPS. So yeah, a long time, and you're never done.
Okay, great. And what are some of the lessons learned to prevent making mistakes in creating a vigorous learning organization?
I don't know, maybe Jack can chip in, but it's avoiding some of the issues of leadership that were back on that slide, I think 6 or 7. It's actually realizing that you're into a major transformation involving people. By the way, the old Toyota sensei that I was around never referred to implementing TPS. It was creating TPS. You can implement software and you can install a carpet, but if you're developing people, you are trying to do something that creates a change. Jack?
Doc, I think that's a good point, but I think there's also, we talk about how to not make mistakes, but the reality is that if you're a leader, you have to give room for people to make mistakes to learn something new. And I think that's a big aspect. The other aspect is that the leaders, and they may be leaders at multiple levels in your organization, have to set up systems, procedures, and policies that support the implementation of the methods. The methods themselves are really goals, but lean is not a goal. Lean is a continuous process and maybe an alternative management model. So that, I think that's what I would add to it, Doc.
Yeah, and I'd add to that a leader is not afraid of admitting their own mistakes. Geez, I've probably made quite a few just since we started the presentation. We all do.
Right.
Well, that's how we learn. Is that not learning process? I mean, yes. You look at your child, you look at your grandson or granddaughter, and as they're infants, they have no problem making the mistakes and failing in order to learn a language or even how to walk. So by nature, human beings are failing and learning and heuristic in that they learn continuously. Maybe that's what the organization will ultimately be.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about the organization you worked with, and the only one that finally couldn't go through a pretty big transformation was the one that had been so successful they thought they had never made a mistake and maybe weren't capable of it.
Yeah, well, that's true. For years, we developed a merger policy for a company called Noble. I was senior vice president in charge of strategic planning and one of my jobs were during a merger to keep the young entrepreneurs that we would buy companies from. Now, the difference between an entrepreneur is he has made mistakes. It's a very unusual leader that you get. The one company that had a long history that belonged to us couldn't understand why the world didn't stay the same for the way they were doing things. And I guess that's the key thing here also, that leaders for transformation recognize that the world is slightly different each time you go out and open the door.
Any more questions?
Okay, great. Just one more. What were the key takeaways that the janitors had when they learned new concepts?
Quite a few. I'd say that what you could really tell with the janitors was that they had a lot more pride in themselves because they had a lot more knowledge of what they were doing and why. And nobody ever explained it to them or expected them to learn it. So I remember asking one what he'd learned about cleaning that he wished the president of his institution knew. And he said, I wish he knew that his telephone and his desk have a far higher concentration of pathogens than a toilet seat. So a lot. You transform a janitor into somebody that knows more about cleaning and can practice it than most of us have ever gotten into.
Okay.
The pride shows.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jack and Doc, for sharing your examples, and thank you, everyone, for the questions. And thank you, Doc, Monique, and Jack, for a very informative presentation. This brings our webinar to a close. Our next webinar will be on Friday, February 20th, on Making Daily Kaizen a Success. Please note that the last webinar for today's series on compression thinking is scheduled for March 4th, titled Getting Started, Vigorous Learning Organizations. Please visit AME.org under AME Events and Training for more information and to register. And don't forget to fill out the short survey that will be in your inbox. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a productive day.